Welcome to you all. My name's Andrew Chung, Artistic Producer of London Symphonia, and today I've got with me our new principal cellist, Ben Bolt-Martin. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Andrew. How you doing?
I am just fine. Looking forward very much to our concert called Forbidden Music on November the 4th. So thanks for joining me. This is a really interesting program because it's all string quartet. And we've got our good friend with us, Tom Allen, who will be joining us for the concert, master storyteller. So we are not going to touch the whole story element of this concert. It's very much a combination of story and music and the intersection thereof. But we'll leave the storytelling to Tom. And today, let's spend some time talking about string quartet. You know, what's the big deal? What's it like to play string quartet? That kind of stuff. So, you know, when I think about string quartet, Ben, it almost has a legendary kind of status as a compositional vehicle. I think you'll find all great composers have composed or tried their hand at string quartet. Why is that so?
Well, it's an interesting sort of a interesting problem. I think not a problem. What's the word I'm looking for? It's when you do write for a whole bunch of different instruments that have a lot of different qualities to them, like winds and winds and mixed ensembles and that kind of thing. It's beautiful how many different colors you have to work with. However, it's interesting to note that when you do write for mixed ensembles, there is a sort of a sense of almost limitation that's put in place because you have those specific colors in mind. You've got those, for example, when you have a couple of winds and some strings and some whatever, you've got beautiful colors that you can mix between and stuff like that. But over time, as the piece gets longer, you're sort of pigeonholed within the compositional style. You're kind of pigeonholed as to what each instrument sort of means. The beautiful thing about string quartet is because there's this similarity, this crossover, if you will, between the instruments. Very quickly, you actually sort of, it's almost like an impressionist painting to begin with, because you almost immediately lose track of what each individual voice is doing, and it sort of becomes the background to what's happening in your imagination. You hear the tunes, you hear the melodies, you hear the compositional style kind of come through like a magic eye puzzle in a way that you don't really when you are working with a mixed ensemble. So string quartets, I mean, as you said, they're legendary, they're epic. And often that's just because they're these massive works, and our brains are able to sort of tune out the individual instruments and sort of go directly into the story. And so it's really very cool to be doing string quartets with storytelling, because in a lot of ways, string quartets have this capacity for telling stories because the similarities of the instruments themselves make the whole ensemble sort of move to the background, and what you're left with is the story, the sort of narrative structure of the music itself that doesn't always come through when you're playing with mixed ensembles. Mixed ensembles, you're very much aware of, well, here's the oboe playing this tune, and here's the bass is now playing this tune, and you're very much aware of who's doing what. And so, which is another amazing way of hearing the music. But with string quartet, that kind of disappears into the background, and you're left with just the sort of narrative structure of the music itself. So I think that's why the string quartet becomes such an incredible vehicle for these epic, legendary composers to share their wares, because you're actually left in a lot of ways not hearing the performers per se. You're left hearing what it is that the composer has to say through that whole structure.
And I guess it provides a very fertile ground to experiment too. I mean, you consider Haydn and how many string quartets he produced. I mean, part of that was just making some coin, of course. And
yeah, he had his deadline.
He experimented through it. It's a familiar form to him by that stage, and he keeps experimenting and keeps pushing it throughout his whole compositional career.
Yeah. I love the as I said, because there is so much uh, uh, because the ensemble itself becomes just a sort of a palette for the actual painting of the music. It does become very much yeah, as you said, a fertile ground for people um, who have the creative juices to make it happen. And with all the different combinations of sounds available within the string quartet, it does create all these sort of, it's almost like, in some ways it's kind of like um, building a Sudoku or building chess problems. It's like you've got a very sort of set bunch of parameters, but it also, within that set bunch of parameters, you're creating sort of these intricate problems to solve as a composer. Like, I think you're finding ways of transferring melodies from one player to the next, of how do you combine the different instruments to create different things, and you're creating these sort of puzzles for yourself when you're composing for the string quartet. I think it really does lend itself to someone who has a sort of a problem solving kind of bent. And I think Haydn definitely had that. Like, I think he probably, as you said, he had to make some coin, but he had this weekly job. So he probably had to crank one out every so often, something new for his employer. And that sort of problem really lent itself probably to his brain and to the ensemble, because you've got all these different ways of coming to the same, so coming to similar solutions, but always with just a little bit of a difference every time. So I think there's a puzzle making kind of aspect to it too, that I think really appeals to a certain kind of compositional mind.
Now, sometimes a composer decides to make it quite a democratic sort of quartet, and where each of the four voices gets equal airplay, so to speak. And sometimes it's more virtuosic for the first violinist, and you're just like, oh gosh, this is just a showcase here.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, from a compositional standpoint, as most orchestrators will tell you, the first and easiest rule to follow is that your ear is always drawn to the uppermost voice. So you're almost always going to hear what's up on top. And so the first violin being the highest voice, it's much easier to write something that will be heard in the violin. So going back to the idea of making puzzles, this idea of making a piece that's more democratic, because there's cello players and viola players who want to have the tune every now and again too. That becomes sort of the puzzle of it. So if you can find ways that you can give the tune and give the interesting things to the lower voices, that's part of the puzzle solution. But from a basic orchestrational standpoint, it is much easier to hear what's going on top. And so, yeah, so most of the time, especially in the early quartets, and I mean, all the way through the quartet repertoire, the first violin still does have most of the heavy lifting to do. But the puzzle making aspect of it really does lend itself among the great composers to trying to find ways of giving their colleagues, the ones who work just as hard to play the cello or the viola, giving them something interesting to do too. So I mean, in Haydn, you certainly see throughout, as he sort of developed the string quartet repertoire, his cellist, and I wish I knew his name right now, I've forgotten, but was renowned to be a really great musician. And so he wrote these beautiful cello concertos, the C major and D major concerto. And so this cellist was also playing his string quartets. And so Haydn was always trying to find ways compositionally so that you could hear the cello really clearly doing these cool little things. And that was part of his puzzle brain, I think, was trying to figure out how he was going to take these really good musicians and use them fully, because he had them all the time. And why make the first violinist learn all the notes? You can throw some of that candy to the lower voices as well.
So from the cellist chair, typically, maybe in this concert or in other string quartet concerts, what is your role?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, as you try to get more democratic, you share these around, but in a sort of a basic level. The cellist, it's the base of the quartet. Like in any jazz ensemble, you're kind of relying on your rhythm section to sort of establish the feel, establish the pulse, and for the cellist, and certainly the inner voices, the second violin and the viola, it's really an important part of our function to really lay down a solid feeling for the whole ensemble. And so much of what the way that the narrative structure comes through has to do with that kind of feel and pulse that happens in the lower strings, and especially in the cello. The cello's job is very much to sort of establish the mood, establish the pulse, establish the sound. In a lot of the old sort of famous quartets, it's the sound of the cellist that really establishes the sound of the quartet. But you got these cellists who just establish the sound of the quartet by establishing the feel and the pulse and all that kind of stuff from the bottom end. And that's very much like what you would expect the bass player in a jazz ensemble or any sort of rhythm section member to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, string quartet, it's conductorless.
Yeah.
So, you know, a lot of communication comes from gesture. You know, people have to be that little bit more demonstrative. They have to understand who's cueing what when, and I guess it provides it exercises a part of our brain as orchestral musicians that we don't always exercise. We rely on the conductor to kind of lay down the beat and the tempo. And tell me a little bit about communication.
Well, one of the really great parts about actually working with London Symphonia is that we have a sort of a tradition of communicating with each other as a bit of a smaller orchestra, and so much of the things that we as an ensemble take very seriously really are chamber music ideas. And the idea of creating communication. Sorry, maybe we can do it a little bit of an edit here. Sorry, I'm just if you give me a couple seconds. So the idea of communication among chamber music players it's not that different actually from what we do tend to do in the orchestra setting. It's just it tends to be a little bit more obvious because we're creating our own leadership, I guess, within the thing. We're creating our own ideas of the music. We're creating our own, I guess, our own narrative structure within the music as well. So much of what we're communicating is actually sort of a shared conversation in a way that isn't necessarily always the case when we're working with an orchestra. The actual the two-wayness of the communication is maybe the big difference. In many ways, we're sharing ideas within the orchestra structure as well, but a lot of them are sort of going one way, and we sort of receive the information and acknowledge that information has been received. But within the chamber music setting, we're actually sort of creating a sort of a yes and kind of scenario, very much in the same sort of way as improvised theater or improvisation in general. So that sort of, oh, I see what you're doing there. I see the information you're giving me, and here's the information I have to share going backwards. And so it's very much a conversational style as opposed to a sort of a information received kind of style of communication, which I think it's something that can definitely find its way back into the orchestral performance way of doing things, but it becomes really obvious when we're doing it within the chamber music series that it becomes more of a yes and situation. So we're creating a real two-way communication in a way that doesn't always get to happen when we're sitting there in a larger ensemble, just for sheer issues of just for the sheer numbers. I guess that would be the main reason why it doesn't always work the same way in an orchestra setting.
So looking at this program, we have Schulhoff, Erwin Schulhoff. We've got Eric Korngold. We have Mozart, and we've got Walter Kaufmann. So with the pieces that are being represented, do we get a sense for what these composers are like? And for those who don't know Schulhoff and Korngold, is this typical for them? Or are we getting to see a side of them that it's not so familiar?
Well, what we're seeing a lot with actually, we're seeing very much the bread and butter of most of these composers. Schulhoff, actually, this is really interesting. We'll probably get a little bit of taste of this from Tom, but he was a real Dadaist, and Dada being silliness and the absurdity of life kind of thing like that. And so this material that we hear from Schulhoff is this sort of really cool combination of really serious, beautiful music making, but with a silly kind of undertone. So, for example, the first movement of the Schulhoff is it's called a waltz style, but it's written in 2/2. And for those of you who understand waltzes, they're not written in 2/2. So he's actually specifically taken something, a beautiful, intricate way of writing music, and put a little absurdist spin on it, and that's very much right in the ballpark of Schulhoff's work. There's always this teetering between serious and almost tragic music and silly, thumbing your nose at the establishment kind of thing. And then you've got your Mozart, this is really, I mean, we consider this sort of the pinnacle of Mozart's success. But if you think about it, this may be the middle of an arc of his genius that arrived at this beautiful place where he's writing these beautiful tunes, and his compositional puzzle making mind has created this opportunity for the viola and the cello to have these great moments that are orchestrated so beautifully within the quartet. This really does show off where Mozart was compositionally at the time. He was really stretching his muscles and showing how brilliant he was. So it was just very much right within the ballpark of what he was doing at the time. So very brilliant explanation, sort of where Mozart's mind was at this time in his life.
And what about Korngold? I mean, I think of Korngold and the movie music that he produced when he was living in Hollywood, and then I think of that remarkable, opera of his, Die Todesstaat. And what do we hear in this quartet?
Well, I think you may find that this, I mean, you're definitely going to feel moments of sort of the Errol Flynn kind of swashbucklingness of it. The movements we're doing are movements that I think tend to be a little bit more introspective. And they're really, I think, probably reflecting a part of Korngold's output that doesn't maybe make it into the movies. It doesn't make it into the violin concerto and stuff like that. That sort of over the top, big harp gestures, big sort of romantic gestures. I think you get a real sense of the density of Korngold's mind and some of the ideas that he didn't get a chance really to put into his more commercial work. So I think this is actually maybe not so representative of, though you are going to hear the beautiful harmonic changes that you have become to associate with those old black and white films for sure. But I think you find it more dense and more compact, less maybe broad sweeping gestures that we've come to be used to with Korngold. I think you'll find it a little bit more introspective and maybe dense, I guess would be a word that I would use, but not in a sort of it is actually very accessible. It's just lots and lots and lots of layers, which is, I think, a little bit different from what we're used to hearing from Korngold. For those of you who are actually familiar with Korngold, and if you're not, you should be, because he's just amazing. Sort of the pre-John Williams, and he's you know, the stuff that he put into the minds of movie watchers is sort of basic to our understanding of what movie music is. So I mean, if you don't know Korngold, you should go listen to some Korngold before you come to the concert.
And then in the case of Walter Kaufmann, of which the quartet is giving the certainly the Canadian premiere.
I think it's the world premiere. I think this was found in a chest of stuff that so this is the first time it's going to be heard.
So there's zero recorded history for this. It's not like you can, look on iTunes and find, okay, and get, a quick oral picture of what this piece sounds like. So you really are relying on the score and your own parts to put it together from scratch. How do you approach that?
I mean, I think in some ways you just got to jump in and hope that you're doing it right. But the other aspect is we do know his life history and where he ended up and what his sort of oral context was. So that's we do know that part of it. And also, once you sort of start going through it, stuff just does sort of leap up at you, and you definitely do get a sense for some of the things that he was being influenced by over his time traveling throughout the world, right? So you get a real sense of the isorhythmic influence of Indian classical music has snuck its way into a couple of movements here. Isorhythmic mean just here's a motive that goes ta 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 ta, and it doesn't really abide by any bar lines and stuff like that, and that kind of sneaks its way into the composition, and some really cool modal ideas. Modal being any scale that doesn't start on do. So you've got a lot of cool little modal motives that are sneaking their way into the writing that just are obvious when you start playing it. So it's part of it is just sort of a trusting your gut kind of thing, and part of it is stuff that just kind of comes out because he's written the notes that he's written, and you follow the instructions. And just like any great, any puzzle, you follow the instructions correctly and you'll get the result that you're looking for. And that's, I think, in a lot of ways, what you deal with when you're dealing with a work that hasn't been performed before. You really do need to follow the instructions as a starting point, and then trust yourself, trust what you're hearing, and lean into that a little bit, and follow those paths that your ear is sort of leading you down. So it's the information is there, but you also have to just bring your artistic self to it, and be a co-creator with the composer and say, yeah, okay, I see what you're doing there. And again, as I was discussing before, it's very much a yes and process. It's like, oh, I hear that, and here's something that I can add to the process from my own context. And I think in some ways, when you get to do the premiere, what you get to do is you get to express yourself in a way that you don't necessarily get to do when something has had 200 years of performance practice layered on top of it. You get a chance to say, okay, here's what I hear, and here's what I think goes with that from my own perspective. And that's a really joyful aspect of the creative process when you get to do a premiere.
Yeah, it's interpretation as a musician in kind of its purest form, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful thing. Well, thank you for joining me today, Ben. I'm really looking forward to hearing the music of this concert, hearing the stories that are behind this music, and hearing what Tom brings to this amazing program. It's a beautiful program. So this is Forbidden Music, to be performed at Metropolitan United Church on November the 4th. Thanks again, Ben.